Hi, this is Raji Rage, and this is a recap on our second session on transfeminism. If you want to know a little bit more about me and my background and experience, head over to the first session recap, and there is a little bit about me in the beginning intro. So we started off this session looking at the radical transfeminism zine. In particular, we started off with an article entitled "What is Radical Transfeminism" by Nat Raha. So the first paragraph states, in my mind, radical transfeminism involves centering trans women, trans femmes, and non-binary trans feminine people in particular next to other trans and non-binary people more generally, to center our bodies, needs, experiences, and importantly, our desires within our political, academic, activist, and organizing work. Our bodily autonomy is at the heart of this. So the rest of the article goes on, to clarify in more detail the perspective of transfeminism in a radical sense. And we spoke to what the differences are between transfeminism in a more kind of mainstream, radical transfeminism, and feminism and those relationships. Nat Raha states it should be clear to center trans feminine people as poor trans feminine people, as trans feminine people of color, as queer trans feminine people, as migrant trans feminine people, as disabled or mad trans feminine people, and those who've been incarcerated in prisons and hospitals. Now that becomes really important and kind of links to our first session where we were looking at bell hooks in terms of bell hooks' criticism of mainstream feminism, particularly in that time of its origins as white feminism, in that it failed, or feminism was failing in that sense that white feminism was just looking to gain equivalent power to their white male counterparts rather than practicing a politics of solidarity with other marginalized groups. So similarly, in this article, Nat Raha is also stating similar in that, if we really are going to center trans feminine people, we need to look at the most marginalized and outlaying who those people are and be in solidarity with them and not to kind of ignore or erase those trans feminine people. What we also really appreciated about this article is that Nat Raha leaves us with a lot of questions. So it's not just making a statement and a definition of transfeminism, but also asking questions. For example, if we're rooting a feminist practice in trans feminine bodies, what does this open up as a horizon of politics? What is needed to expand and develop our bodily autonomy? What practices must we put forward? Social, sexual, healthcare, and in living. What conversations must be broached? What work must be undertaken to make our lives richer, to create the ground and conditions under which we thrive? And the reason why we like these questions is because it doesn't allow us to just consume this in a lazy way of, okay, this is a statement, this is a definition, and that's it. We are left with questions, which means we have to question them. We have to provide answers. We have to practice those answers, and we have to see how we are implicated by them. So we really appreciated that article for that reason. So we moved on to look at Sons of the Movement by Bobby Noble. FDMs risking incoherence on a post-queer cultural landscape. And if I recall correctly, this was written either in the late 90s or early 2000s. I think early 2000s. So we started off with the article Sons of the Feminist Movement, Tranny Fags, Lesbian Men, and Other Post-Queer Paradoxes. So Bobby Noble starts off with, in her book, Am I the Name? Feminism and the Category of Women, Denise Riley makes a similar assertion, arguing that feminism needs to refuse to locate itself in categorical and essentialist foundations. Riley suggests that feminism must entertain the possibility of contingency, indeterminacy, and instability as a willful epistemology and politic. Given that these passionate fictions of gender, sexuality, embodiment, class, race, nation, and ethnicity are all historically specific and enmeshed within the lived histories of other concepts like the social, the subject, constructions of power, the mind, the soul, the body, capitalism, and economies, etc. Riley asked, why does feminism attempt to secure its politics to a fixed and ahistorical sense of gender? So, yeah, we discussed the importance of moving beyond gender as a kind of bioessentialist category and term. Again, going back to what Bell Hooks also similarly states in A Will to Change about moving beyond this essentialism of gender, that feminism is a practice and it's about how our actions and our behavior, but also feminism is for everybody. Everybody's implicated and everybody needs to participate in it to kind of move beyond this system, which is white supremacist patriarchy. So Noble's saying something similar, but in regards to the argument between whether transmasculine people can be part of feminism, or who does feminism belong to? So Noble goes on to kind of state more personally, I do not find home in the word lesbian any longer, even though that's my dating pool. But I want to be very clear that I'm not here as a transsexual man knocking at the door of the feminist movement, asking to be let in. I have been in, of, and indeed have been the feminist movement. And in my work on masculinity and in my burgeoning identity as a transsexual man, I continue to wear that banner with a great sense of history and with a great deal of pride, if not frustration. So, and then he goes on to say, instead of imagining that female to male transsexual men are inside the Trojan horse when we come into feminist movements, we need to rethink our movements to understand that trans men are actually inside of the belly of beast when we leave feminist spaces. And then describes kind of being sons of the movement in that sense. So what we thought was really important here is this discussion of this kind of contention of whether feminism allows or includes men, or whether that be cis or trans men, and Noble stating that we are part of the movement. We've been part of that in various socializations, whether we've been socialized as female, whether we've been part of feminist movements prior to kind of transitioning in that sense, but also when trans men leave those spaces, that they're also having to be in the belly of the beast of patriarchy and needing to carry both those things. So not just saying, oh, yes, we're part of the feminist movements, but also saying, well, yes, but we're also part of patriarchy as well, and carrying both of those things. But also we spoke about, a lot of trans-exclusionary feminist discourses around seeing and the divisiveness between kind of trans men and trans women, and seeing trans men as Trojan horses, and how we need to kind of move away from these divisive narratives while still kind of being accountable to being part of patriarchy. So then we moved on to look at what Noble speaks about in terms of Jack Halberstam's contribution with their publication Female Masculinity. And whilst we also discussed how that female masculinity it has been critiqued over the years and has been seen as a problematic text in many ways, it also did a lot to open up this kind of separation of masculinity from cis men, which becomes really important to acknowledge that masculinity exists outside of cis masculinity. And that's something that we obviously are embodying as trans masculine people within kind of, these discussions. So, we kind of read that section about, how Jack Halberstam proposes that and also gives us multiple engenderings in his work. That was something we discussed, as well as this idea of this binary of good side and bad side, and how these models are very singular thinking and non-intersectional, as well as the fact that, if we're stating that that FDMs, FDMs or transmasculine people are not part of feminist practice, then we're not really thinking about whiteness either. We're not thinking about how whiteness intersects. They describe that or explain that by saying, if we're seeing only FDM transsexual male privilege, then for example, if we're thinking about trans women of color or trans FDMs of color, we're not thinking about, they're transitioning into a privileged gender position, but we're not kind of really thinking that doesn't really work the same for a white trans person as opposed to a trans person of color. So race definitely comes into it. We can't kind of look at this in a single issue or a single line of thinking. So we had a discussion on we had a discussion between us about our own experiences and embodiments. We were thinking about how we are impacted by transfeminism, and then what solidarities we can show. So, for example, I was thinking about the divisions that exist that don't allow solidarities to occur in the first place. And I was also thinking about things like the pay gap, which is something that I feel is a very systemic structural issue of the pay gap between men and women. And as someone who is transgender and transmasculine, but also legally male, I participate in that. And I'm forced into this complicity to participate in patriarchal systems in that way. And even though there's been a lot of kind of feminism around the pay gap, there's not much movement that's happened on that front. In terms of other things that I felt were possible were things like access to healthcare, and looking at kind of what is needed with access to healthcare. So, for example, trans men might have more difficulties accessing hormones than trans women, but trans women have higher costs when it comes to things like electrolysis and so on. So, what are the solidarities that I can share and show about creating resources for healthcare? We also spoke about the differences between, the kind of solidarities between trans men and trans women, looking in a kind of, we spoke in a more kind of binary sense between those two categories, and how, for example, in the West, there's a lot more kind of privilege with trans masculinity than there is, for example, in the global South. So, for example, we used India as an example where trans women organizing in solidarities and visibility is very organized and very well represented, even though there is, an immense amount of violence towards those groups. There is this sense of organizing in community, whereas trans masculinity is more invisibilized, is harder to find, and is more difficult to kind of organize around. So we spoke about how those differences exist between the West and the global South, and some other comments that came through is that some people felt it difficult to be in feminist spaces because they kind of accrued feminist spaces with women's spaces, and they didn't want to be misgendered as a woman in those spaces. And that was a really interesting point in terms of how we locate ourselves, what spaces we enter in, depending on how we are then kind of visibilized based on our politics. We kind of ended the session looking at Masculine Femininities Zine, particularly issue 6, and an article kind of following on to the conversation we were having about the global South and the West. There was an article by Kaveri and Living Small Vidya entitled Transgender and Caste Lived Experience, Transphobia as a Form of Brahminism. And there's a part in there where, Living Small Video, Smiley introduces the conversation by speaking about what it means to be a trans person of Dalit lower caste identity and experience. And then Kaveri asked this question, Did you experience being raised as a child who was considered male by the family and brought up as a boy, but identifying and later living as a woman, give you a heightened sense of privileges given to men over women? For example, the first time I wore men's clothes and walked down the street, I realized ways in which I was oppressed as a woman that were invisible to me when the world looked at me and saw a woman. I realized suddenly I could look around at eye level without lewd stares from men or disapproving stares from older people. And I realized the social pressure on women to look at the ground when they walked, something I knew in the back of my head, but hadn't realized the full extent of until I dressed in men's clothes and was liberated from it. It sharpened my feminism in a similar way for you, seeing both male privilege from society and identifying with women and later living as a woman and facing the dangers of being a woman and a trans person. Can you talk about the way this journey has shaped your understanding of gender oppression? And Living Smile Video replies, I was a woman in my heart as a child, even as I was being given male privilege. I hated it because I dearly loved my sisters and my mother, my biological mother, as well as my stepmother. I identified with them and was so angry that my sisters didn't get the same things as me. I was mistaken to be male and couldn't yet articulate that I was a girl. And so I was educated much more than my sisters. I still always believed my older sister was very smart, smarter than me, and her life would be very different now if she'd been educated. She's doing the same work as my mother only because she was born a biological woman and similar to my mother in the backbone of the household. But from the beginning, I was able to influence my stepmother to be different. And so her daughter, my sister, is now studying in her final year in education. This makes me happy as despite being female born, she has joined the first generation of our family getting educated along with me. So we discussed this paragraph and we kind of went back to I mentioned kind of this first session with Bell Hooks and how she kind of located feminism as being stuck or staying in this place of having to defend itself and being located in the problem, right? And similarly, we spoke about how with trans feminist discourses, we often get stuck because we have to constantly defend ourselves as trans people, as trans feminine people, as trans people in general. We're constantly defending ourselves and our existences. So therefore, we kind of get stuck on having to do that. And we sometimes don't move on to these nuanced discussions. And we appreciated that this article gave us a nuanced discussion about patriarchy and transfeminism in one encompassing way. We spoke about how this is difficult to do outside of trans communities and maybe outside of trans feminist communities because we're constantly kind of having to kind of justify our existence and our presence, that we can't do anything that might be seen divisive or might be seen as complicating our narratives. We kind of appreciated that Kari and Living Smiles, a conversation, really spoke to this complexity of being part of maybe both, being part of patriarchy and being part of transfeminism, and those kind of those relationships between both, despite how you may identify it, also being based on how other people perceive you and how they decide to kind of put on you. We didn't read the whole article. I definitely recommend people read that. This is online on Masculinities at WordPress.com, and there's 6 issues, 6 being the latest. These were written in the early 2000s, kind of most of the 2000s, and have been archived and unarchived for these sessions. So that was a recap on session 2. If you want to attend to session 3 and 4, please book with Healing Justice London on their Eventbrite. So you can go to healingjustice.org or follow them on Healing Justice LDN London on Instagram. Thank you very much.